They told you the first president of the United States was George Washington. They carved his face into stone. They printed his portrait on currency. They wrapped his image in myth and called it destiny. From elementary school classrooms to marble monuments in the Capitol, the story was simple, polished, and final. America began under Washington. But what if that story was not the whole truth? What if the very foundation of American leadership was built on a quiet erasure? What if the first president was not the man on the dollar bill, and the truth was deliberately compressed into a footnote so small that generations never saw it? Because before George Washington placed his hand on the Bible in 1789, another man had already held the title of President of the United States. His name was John Hanson, and the fact that most Americans have never heard that name is not an accident. It is a story of constitutional confusion, political myth-making, and the deliberate shaping of national memory. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to a time before the Constitution, before the polished republic, back to a fragile confederation stitched together by war. In 1776, the 13 colonies declared independence from Britain, but independence was only the beginning. What followed was chaos: unpaid soldiers, collapsing currency, foreign threats, and states that behaved like small, suspicious countries rather than a unified nation. The fledgling United States needed structure. It needed coordination. It needed leadership. So in 1781, after years of debate, the states ratified the Articles of Confederation, creating the first national government of the United States. This government did not have an executive branch like we know today. There was no powerful presidency, no cabinet, no centralized authority commanding armies or vetoing legislation. Instead, there was Congress. And Congress elected a presiding officer. That office carried a formal title, President of the United States, and Congress assembled. On November 5, 1781, that office was filled by John Hanson. Hanson was not a general. He was not a towering plantation owner from Virginia. He was a merchant and statesman from Maryland. But when Congress selected him as its presiding officer, he became by title President of the United States. This was not symbolic. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress was the national government. There was no separate executive. The President of Congress signed documents, corresponded with foreign powers, oversaw administrative matters, and in many ways embodied the leadership of the nation. Hanson served a one-year term. During that time, the Revolutionary War was still underway. He dealt with financial instability, troop demobilization, and diplomatic recognition. He presided over Congress as it accepted the British surrender at Yorktown's aftermath and navigated the fragile early sovereignty of the new republic. And yet his name is rarely mentioned outside specialized historical discussions. Why? Because after the war ended and the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation became undeniable, a new document was drafted, the Constitution of 1787. This Constitution created a radically different office, a singular executive with defined powers, independent authority, and national visibility. It created what Americans now recognize as the presidency. In 1789, George Washington was elected under this new constitutional framework. He was not the first man to hold the title President of the United States, but he was the first president under the Constitution. That distinction matters. But over time, nuance was erased. The founders themselves understood the difference. They did not consider the presidency under the Articles equivalent to the executive created in 1787. The earlier office was primarily procedural, a presiding officer chosen by Congress, not a nationally elected executive. Yet as American mythology grew, complexity became inconvenient. A nation prefers clean origin stories. Washington became the first president, not because no one held the title before him, but because the new constitutional order redefined what the presidency meant. The old office faded into obscurity, but obscurity is not the same as non-existence. John Hanson was not alone. Before Washington, several men served as president of Congress under the Articles of Confederation, including Peyton Randolph, Henry Laurens, John Jay, and others. Hanson's distinction lies in being the first to serve a full one-year term after the Articles were fully ratified by all 13 states. And that ratification detail is where the controversy lives. Some historians argue that because Maryland was the last state to ratify the Articles in 1781, and Hanson was elected after that ratification, he was technically the first president of the fully unified United States government. This claim has been amplified in certain circles as proof that Washington was not the first president. But the reality is more layered. The presidency under the Articles had no independent executive power. It had no veto authority. It had no control over a standing army. It was not elected by the people or an electoral college. It was chosen by members of Congress and largely functioned as a moderator and administrator. Calling Hanson the first president in the same sense as Washington would be misleading. Yet erasing him entirely is equally misleading. The shock is not that Washington was not first. The shock is that American civic education rarely explains the transition between two completely different governmental systems. The real foundational lie is not that Washington served first. It is that the story of American leadership begins neatly in 1789. It does not. It begins in confusion, experiment, and fragility. During Hanson's presidency, Congress established Thanksgiving as a national day of observance in 1782. It adopted the Great Seal of the United States. It managed foreign affairs and struggled to pay soldiers. It dealt with mutinies and financial crisis. These were not ceremonial tasks. They were existential. Yet when the Constitution replaced the Articles, the previous system was treated almost like a draft that never counted. The national memory pivoted hard toward the stronger executive model, and the earlier presidents of Congress became historical footnotes. Why would a nation simplify its own origin? Because power shapes narrative. The Constitution was framed as a corrective to weakness. Federalists argued that the Articles created a government too feeble to survive. By elevating Washington as the first president, the new system symbolically reset the clock. It framed 1789 as year one. The earlier period became a prelude rather than a beginning. This was not necessarily a malicious conspiracy. It was nation-building through storytelling. But storytelling always chooses emphasis. And when emphasis becomes repetition, repetition becomes truth. Over time, monuments, textbooks, and civic rituals reinforce the narrative. Washington was father of his country. He set precedents. He defined the executive branch. He stepped down voluntarily, shaping democratic norms. All of that is true. But what disappeared in the retelling was the messy prologue. The presidency did not emerge fully formed. It evolved. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government had no power to tax. It could not compel states to provide troops or funds. Economic instability led to unrest like Shays' Rebellion in 1786–87. These crises exposed structural weaknesses. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was not simply an upgrade, it was a reinvention. The executive office created in Article 2 of the Constitution bore little resemblance to the presiding officer of Congress under the Articles. Washington's presidency represented a new experiment entirely. But here is where document shock enters the story. The Articles of Confederation explicitly use the title President of the United States in Congress assembled. That phrase is preserved in historical records. It is not folklore. It is written law. That means technically that someone held the title before Washington. The shock is not fabricated. It is documented. The question is not whether Hanson held the title. He did. The question is whether holding that title made him equivalent to the constitutional presidency Americans celebrate. It did not. But the refusal to explain that difference clearly has fueled decades of confusion, and in some cases, deliberate myth-making. In the 20th century, certain advocacy groups and state historians promoted Hanson as the real first president, sometimes to elevate regional pride or challenge federal narratives. Statues were erected. Claims were printed in pamphlets. The nuance disappeared again, this time in the opposite direction. History swung from erasure to exaggeration. The truth lives in the middle. Washington was the first president under the United States Constitution. Hanson was the first president of Congress after full ratification of the Articles of Confederation. Both statements are accurate, but only one made it into national memory. This selective remembering reveals something deeper about American identity. The country prefers strong beginnings. It prefers heroic founders over experimental committees. It prefers marble certainty over procedural evolution. And so the fragile Confederation years are compressed into a blur between 1776 and 1789. That compression has consequences. When citizens believe their institutions sprang into existence fully formed, they misunderstand how governments evolve. They lose sight of how constitutional design responds to crisis. They forget that American democracy was not inevitable. It was negotiated, revised, and sometimes nearly abandoned. John Hanson's obscurity is not a scandal in the sense of conspiracy. It is a symptom of how nations curate memory. But in a broader sense, it does change everything. Because if the first chapter of the presidency has been simplified, what else has been streamlined for comfort? What other transitions have been flattened into clean narratives? The early republic was unstable. The Articles government was weak by design. Many Americans feared centralized authority after living under British rule. The pendulum swung towards state sovereignty, and then swung back when that model proved insufficient. Washington's presidency did not emerge from triumph alone. It emerged from failure. Understanding Hanson's role forces us to confront that failure. It reminds us that the United States had a first attempt at national government that did not work as intended. It reminds us that the presidency itself was born from revision. And it challenges the idea that history is a straight line. If Hanson is remembered only as a trivia question, was Washington really first? The deeper lesson is missed. The deeper lesson is institutional transformation. The presidency Americans know today is not static. It has expanded dramatically since 1789. Executive power has grown through war, legislation, judicial interpretation, and precedent. From Washington's cautious leadership to the sweeping authority exercised during the Civil War under Abraham Lincoln, to the global executive power of modern administrations, the office has continuously evolved. Recognizing the earlier presidency under the Articles reveals that evolution in its earliest stage. It shows that titles alone do not define power. Structures do. And structures can change. In the end, the accusation embedded in this story is not that America lied about Washington. It is that America simplified itself. It presented a polished origin instead of a complicated birth. John Hanson's relative obscurity is not an injustice of race or suppression in the way other historical erasures have been. It is a reminder that institutional memory is selective. But selective memory shapes civic understanding. When citizens learn that there was a president before Washington, even if only in a different governmental form, they are forced to reconsider what first really means. They are forced to look closer. And when people look closer at their foundations, they often discover cracks, not fatal ones, but human ones. That discovery does not weaken democracy. It strengthens it. Because mature nations do not fear complexity. They embrace it. America's first president was hidden, not in a secret archive, not in a burned document, but in the quiet margins of a transitional government that did not survive. And understanding that hidden chapter changes everything about how we see beginnings. It reveals that power is defined by structure, that titles can shift meaning, and that national memory is shaped as much by storytelling as by fact. George Washington remains the first president under the Constitution. John Hanson remains the first president of the United States in Congress assembled after full ratification of the Articles of Confederation. Both are true, but only one became legend. The question is not whether Washington deserves his place. He does. The question is whether we are willing to tell the whole story. Because the moment we admit that the presidency had an earlier form, weaker, different, experimental, we acknowledge that America itself was once uncertain, unfinished, and fragile. And that realization changes everything. It reminds us that the nation was built not only by giants carved in stone, but also by administrators whose names faded when the structure they served was replaced. History does not always erase with fire. Sometimes it erases with simplification. And sometimes the most powerful revelations are not about scandal, but about structure.